if you like, there are two things that drive me and drive our business. And I think one is delicious food, but sitting alongside that and woven into it as well is this belief that business can be and should be a force for good.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in an increasingly complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark. And our article today is titled Food Waste Breakthrough Launches to Help Cities Halve Food Waste, Cut Emissions, and Save Money. A new UN-backed initiative aimed at helping cities measure and dramatically reduce the food they throw away. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that an absolute true expert is in the room today to unpick all of this with me. Charlie Bigham, founder of Charlie Bigham's and a pioneering UK food business leader. Charlie, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Lovely to join you, Charlie. Looking forward to our chat.
Indeed. Now, Charlie, I know that many of our viewers and listeners, especially in the UK, will very much be aware of you and have probably tucked into one of your absolutely delicious meals at certain points in time. But for those that aren't aware of the organization and what you guys do, would you mind just providing a bit more meat on the bone?
So just a little summary of who we are. So we're a business which is all about making delicious food. We make pre-prepared food, never ready meals, which we sell across the UK, mostly in supermarkets. We have a fantastic team of about 750 people who are all focused on one thing and one thing only, really, which is making our food even more delicious. We produce our food in our own kitchens. We have one in London and one in Somerset, and we have a lot of fun doing it.
Well, I love that as an introduction. It's always good to hear that people are having fun doing what they do with their careers. But Charlie, I am super intrigued. Like, how did we get here? Take us back, if you will, to the kind of formative experiences that really sort of shaped your view of the world and ultimately inspired you to build the business.
So this is an important year for us. This is our 30th year. So we're going to have our 30th birthday towards the end of this year. So I have been at this a while. So I have to cast my mind back a long way to how I got here. I started life as a management consultant, which was great, but I quite quickly worked out I wasn't very good at working for other people, and I thought I'd be better off working for myself. Fortunately, that was a good call. I love doing my own thing and not being answerable to anyone, apart from, of course, our consumers. Started, traditional, I guess, British startup, kitchen table at home, and we've just kept going for 30 years. We've grown a bit every year, and as I said, at the beginning, we've now grown to a team of 750 fantastic people. And I get for those of your listeners who are interested, because some people are on this, in terms of revenue terms, we're sort of around the 150 million mark, and we're still growing strongly, and we've got lots to do, which is really exciting. We're still in the foothills, even after 30 years.
I love that. We've got a headline already. We're still in the foothills after 30 years. But Charlie, I think from lots of our listeners and viewers out there that are, starting their own thing, that are at that kitchen table, if you like, that you were 30 years ago. Just want to ask you about your thoughts and your experiences and your sort of your intentions, if you like, at the time. Did you know, or were you clear in your vision that you were going to realize what the organization has come to be today, or has it surprised you in terms of what you've built?
I think I started the business with an ambition. I didn't want to start a business just employing, a couple of dozen people and making, some food for a handful of customers or a handful of shops. I remember a friend of mine, actually, when you start when you start businesses, you rope in your sort of friends and family and get them to try your first products and ask for feedback. And, I had this job as a management consultant, and this was a grown up job, I guess. And one of my friends said to me, well, this is all very hard, Charlie, but what are you planning to do with this? What's the vision? And this was, from my kitchen table at home. And I said, well, I think stage one is to get to, a 20 million pound business. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that says I had a little bit of ambition to start with. Yeah, because that seemed like quite an ambitious thing to say when I just made 10 meals on my kitchen table, and that had been quite hard work. But then I think I've been pleasantly surprised how the business has, continued to gather momentum and still continues to gather momentum. And I think that's down to, we were lucky. Every business needs to be lucky. People sometimes forget that every business needs to be lucky. We started at a good time when the UK was more open to new food and things.
What you've just suggested, presumably, my position would be that's sound commercial insight. That's you observing that the conditions were right for you to do what you did at the time. But you don't view it like that. You view it as there were just fortunate, lucky conditions that were at play.
You can pretend you're very clever with hindsight, but I just don't think it's true. I was lucky at the time. 30 years ago, it's quite a long time ago, and so we forget what was happening. So even people my age, you forget what was happening at that time. But it was a time when, newspapers, which now nobody really reads, but then everyone read newspapers, and newspapers suddenly started having food supplements. They'd never done that. There were restaurants opening in London. People were going and on TV really for the second time. There was a sort of pioneer in this, in sort of TV chefs, a guy called Keith Floyd, who was doing stuff in the 70s. But all of that sort of Jamie Oliver stuff, this was all getting going, at about the time I was starting a business, and supermarkets were being bold. And it was 30 years ago was the first time that things like hummus were appearing on a supermarket shelf, which was in turn a reflection of the fact that people were traveling really for the first time, getting out of Europe sometimes for their holidays, going a little bit. So there were a whole load of things that were happening which were nothing to do with me, and I didn't go and look into some teacup and read the tea leaves and see and say, wow, this is amazing. Newspapers are doing this, and TV's doing this, and the travel industry's doing this. So this is the right moment to start a food business. That was just good luck.
Well, it's to hear it coming from somebody like yourself who's done what you've done. It's great to hear that there's a degree, and a significant degree of that comes into building something as successful as you have. Let me ask you about. I want to slightly draw the conversation onto ethics and sustainability and responsibility, and when you think back to the beginnings of the business. Like, how much did those sort of considerations play in your thinking around the development of the company? Or was this something that you kind of got to that kind of scale up stage, if you like, that sort of established stage, and then started sort of thinking about the way that ethics and responsibility and sustainability works? Like, just explain how those elements factored into your thinking about it.
So I have a view on this area which is not going to align with everybody.
Cool.
I think there are some businesses out there which describe themselves as purpose-driven businesses. They kind of almost start with the purpose, and then they create the business to help deliver that purpose. That's not us. And actually, I think it's really, really hard to do that. I think you're much better off saying, let's focus on your product or your service and make that extraordinary. And then if you are fortunate enough to succeed in that, then you can start to try and make progress on wider goals. But I'm very clear, and I think, and not just me, in our business, we're very clear that we are here first and foremost to make delicious food. Mm-hmm. But we think we can do some good things while making delicious food. And obviously, where's our source of those ideas about what we want to do? I think it does come from it sounds a bit, I don't know, it sounds a bit sort of worthy to say it comes from a sort of strong moral core. But I do have a belief in how things should be done. People treated well, behave responsibly, do things for the long term, avoid, celebrate the diversity, all these things. And obviously over time, because I'm human, my views on all of those topics have evolved and grown and become probably, I've got a better understanding in some of those areas, and then other things come up. Nobody was talking about global warming 30 years ago, really. But so global warming is something that's come up the agenda. Something that's really quite recently come onto our agenda, which is important to us, is regenerative agriculture. We're sort of, I think is a really interesting topic. We're not going to probably talk about it for too long today. Really interesting, but actually we're all trying to work out what it means. But I think it's big and important. Another thing that's come onto the agenda fairly recently, or been named at any rate, is ultra-processed food. I mean, actually, that's a really interesting example because that's been a core principle from day one for us. I've always said, if you like, our brand promise to our consumers from day one has been we will only ever put ingredients into our food that I have in my kitchen cupboard or in my fridge at home. And kind of actually, if you're interested in ultra processed food, that's kind of one of the definitions of what ultra processed food is. It's not found in your kitchen cupboard or your fridge at home. So we've been, in some instances, we've been sort of ahead of the curve without knowing it. But I come back to this point: is I think purpose is really important in business, and it's not. It's probably disingenuous to say it's secondary because it's woven into everything we do. But I don't want it ever to make us lose sight of what our real job is, which is to make, fantastic, delicious food that people eat and go, wow.
Well, Charlie, that's so refreshingly honest, in all honesty, in terms of positioning things like that. And I think even as you were referring to the fact that, for example, a challenge like ultra processed food was almost like baked into the original conception of the business. Well, you mentioned that your primary focus was on creating the most delicious, most enjoyable meals you possibly could. Presumably that was just part of the thinking about how to produce that, was to not incorporate ultra processed food because that would probably reduce the quality of said product. Is that a fair observation of how that factored in?
It was partly to do with taste, yes, but actually, ultra processed food, the problem with ultra processed food is it's hyper palatable. It's this combination usually of sugar, fat, salt, which sort of hits off sort of dopamine receptors and stuff in us, and actually we like it as humans. This is that make ultra processed, exploiting something that is actually in our physiology. So in some ways, if you're lazy and you want a shortcut, or you just want a shortcut to profits, maybe ultra processed food is quite good for making things delicious. But we're not about taking shortcuts. We're about doing things properly and doing things in a considered way. And all of that crap that is in ultra processed food is terrible for your health. And we're now discovering terrible for not just your physical health, but your mental health. So how could I have a business that is actually making our consumers unwell? I mean, it's madness. So I'm delighted that we don't do that. We have very strong views on it, and then it's really actually I'm really pleased that the world, from the great work of people like Chris Van Tulleken has woken up to this issue. And I think now ultra processed food, really interestingly, 80% of consumers in the UK are now worried about ultra-processed food. 5 years ago, the term ultra-processed food didn't exist. Nobody knew about it. So it's incredible how quickly things can change.
That is incredible. And even as you say that, I'm just thinking about my own personal experience, and you're right. Like there's been a real awakening, hasn't there, around ultra processed food? And but what I love in what you've just described, it's that whole idea of like getting real about, especially as a business that's been around for as long as you have. Clearly there are new issues, environmental, social, even governance related issues that are going to appear over a 30-year stretch. There are things that we just simply were not aware of 30 years ago that have now become, important issues. But your point is that yes, we will we will address and we will contend and we will try and respond to those issues as they arise, but we're never going to lose sight of what we're ultimately trying to achieve as an organization, which is to deliver a fantastic food experience in the way that you always have.
I think yes, absolutely. But I do think, there are, if you like, there are two things that drive me and drive our business. And I think one is delicious food, but sitting alongside that and woven into it as well is this belief that business can be and should be a force for good. I think actually we're not at the very lowest point, but we're still at quite a low point. People are quite cynical about business. A lot of people, are cynical about business and think it's all about, fat cats sitting in boardrooms, smoking cigars and, exploiting workers. And there are some sort of, larger than life characters that find themselves, because they are larger than life characters, onto the front pages of newspapers and stuff who misrepresent business. They misrepresent business. Or, there are always some people who will have a different view, but one of the things I've been very fortunate over the last 30 years to meet lots of people who run businesses, start businesses, and the vast majority of them are good people who care not just about their business, but about their business's impact on society, on the world, and want to do the right thing, both for their business, but also for their children, for their grandchildren, for the future. And it's just it's not understood that actually business is fundamentally, the majority of people want to do good. And that's putting aside the fact that business actually, is essential to society in terms of creating, providing employment and providing, generating wealth and taxes to pay for the world we live in.
And that's like conflict at play, if you like, within the capitalist system in which we operate, where, shareholder profit maximization is essentially a legal requirement of a public listed company in terms of what they're intending to try and do. And yet, as you say, there are leaders that are starting businesses that want to do more than simply make profit. They want to try and have a positive impact upon the world around them, or certainly not to have a detrimental impact upon the world around them whilst they're developing their business. Can you give me like an example off the top of your head of where you've made a decision, of where there was a decision that you could have made that could have helped make the business more profitable and grow and to be bigger, but that because of that concern around doing business the right way and building the business to not just have not to just be a profit generating machine, but ultimately to be a force for good, if you like. Can you recall decisions like that you've made, and can you share any of those with us?
I think we actually make those decisions every day. I mean, we buy a lot of ingredients. We buy 1,000 different ingredients and pieces of packaging, and you can pretty much always buy something cheaper. And you get a short-term gain from buying something cheaper. So we resist that in our business. We're saying what is the right thing to buy. I suppose a good example would be for those of your listeners and watchers who've eaten our food, they'll probably be familiar with the fact that our food is we package our food in a wooden tray, which is made from poplar, grown in southwest France, made by a fantastic family business, third, fourth generation family business that also makes all the cheese boxes for Camembert and Brie and stuff. So we said, you make these boxes for cheese, could you do something for us? And slightly harder because ours has got to go in an oven, and obviously wood can catch fire, but let's see if we can work something out together. So we sort of long-term project with them, and we've been using those trays for pushing about 20 years now, and we're actually still the only people who use them. And why are we the only people who use them? It's because they're more expensive. A plastic tray is cheaper as an item to buy, not if you looked at its lifetime cost, but as an item at the moment of purchase, it's cheaper. it's also, the wonderful thing about a plastic tray when you start to, if you're trying to do things in some of the packaging bit automatically, because machines do packaging better than people actually, a plastic tray or an aluminium tray is fantastic because it's always exactly the same dimensions. You can have a tolerance of plus or minus, a tenth of a millimeter or something. When using a natural material as we do, it varies quite a lot depending on the weather and lots of other things. But it's fundamentally the right thing to do. It's turned out to be a fantastic thing for the business because it makes us sort of it makes us different, and so it's quite easy for us to spot us on shelf, I think, because of it. But it also conveys a subliminal message to the consumer that we mind a little bit more than other people, and we're a bit more at the sort of what I like to describe as the craft at scale end of things rather than factory end. We're very proud that all of our food we produce in our 2 kitchens. We do not have a factory. We don't employ operatives. We employ lovely people. Yeah, we just have a different take on that.
You implemented that packaging the 20 years ago, did you say?
Yeah. 20
years ago. That's fairly pioneering for you guys to have observed that you wanted to go down that route.
Well, it's kind of, I guess, we were lucky. We came across this. We thought this is an interesting idea, and then we got it to work. I mean, it was a bit of luck and then a bit of hard work.
I love it. The luck again.
And interestingly, Charlie, it still continues to be hard work. I was having a chat with Jason, who looks after our finance, just last night, and there's this very boring for those out of our world, but there's this packaging tax that's just been levied, the extended producer responsibility tax, £1 billion worth of tax the government has just levied on all food businesses. Actually not a bad thing in some ways. But I think yesterday they said they originally put one levy on wooden packaging that we use because they said actually we recognise wooden is the most sustainable packaging there is. And then they've messed it up and they're a bit short of money. So yesterday they sent us a note saying they're going to double the tax on wooden packaging, so that now the tax on wooden packaging is going to be higher than the tax on plastic packaging. And you just think, but and so I was chatting last night, and I said, right, we've got to fight this. We've got to fight this, and we've got to go now, and we've got to go through a formal appeal. We're going to have to lobby. We're going to have to fight it because it's fundamentally wrong. We've done independent scientific analysis of our packaging versus all other formats of packaging, and ours is the best packaging there is for the planet. And yet, in the idiocy of government bureaucracy, and because they've messed up and are short of money, they've thought, we can get a bit more money because we'll just double the tax, just like that, overnight, double it. It's unbelievable, but
laughable. Do you know what? I sometimes reflect on a lot of policy and regulation that's implemented here in the UK, and it seems like we get ourselves into a right pickle a lot of the time, and this is just another example of that. Charlie, let's move on. I could ask you all day about various other areas of how the business has developed over the last 30 years. But for now, if possible, let's move forward with today's article that we're going to be dissecting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting article, which I think was available on a UN website, and it's called Food Waste Breakthrough Launches to Help Cities Halve Food Waste, Cut Methane Emissions and Reduce Hunger. And I had a good read of this article, and it's just fascinating. What a massive issue food waste is globally, and the numbers are quite sort of round in a way. There's a billion tons of food wasted globally, worth $1 trillion. And it contributes. That food waste alone contributes to 10% of global emissions, mostly methane, which is much worse than CO2. So this is a huge problem. And I thought, one of the things that was interesting about the article, And it kind of summarizes, this is a UN activity that started in 2021. And basically the aim was to say, this is the scale of the problem. Let's halve it by 2030. So 9 years, let's halve it across the world. A really good reminder for me reading the article of what an extraordinary thing the UN is. And obviously, especially, where we are today, and we hear the UN lambasted by some people, perhaps by one individual in particular. Its very future is threatened, especially across the breadth of what it does. And the UN does some incredible things across multiple areas. And it's an extraordinary forum to bring countries across the world together and try and achieve a common goal. So it was kind of a nice timely reminder of how important the UN is to us all and how it can tackle these issues which perhaps don't make the headlines, but are very, very important. Just reminder, $1 trillion of waste, 1 billion tons, 10% of global emissions. And we can halve that in 9 years.
I think you mentioned some of the key statistics there. I think the one that absolutely sort of hit me for six was the fact that $1 trillion worth of food that is wasted every year accounts to, I think, 1/3 of all food produced globally, which is just another extraordinary statistic to bear out of this. Let me ask you, the article kind of alludes to the fact that clearly we haven't got a production problem when it comes to food. We've got a problem around distribution. Is that just a overly simplistic sort of view of why this problem exists? Or is that at the very core and the heart of why we find ourselves in this issue?
I think it's a bit simplistic. It's complicated and it's different in different economies around the world. What's interesting is actually whether you looked at, I think their categories are sort of developed, developing, and underdeveloped. But actually, food waste is pretty much the same across all those different three nations at different stages of development. But the waste is in different places depending on where you are. So I think if you're in an undeveloped part of the world, a lot of the waste is around lack of refrigeration and poor transport infrastructure from the site of production, the fields, to the cities. Whereas at the developed end of the world, perhaps in the UK, actually that bit works much better because we have better transport, better refrigeration, but the waste is around consumption habits and retailing habits, and there's a lot of waste generated in the home and in retailers, and indeed with people like us, which I think we might come on to in a moment.
Mm-hmm. So it's far more complicated and nuanced depending upon the circumstances that we find ourselves in, if you like. But let's talk about the solutions that the article proposes. I think the primary one, and this sort of surprised me slightly in considering the immediacy of the changes that are needed, if you like, to hit those 2030 goals. But a lot of was suggested that tracking and analysis around food waste was a really, really core thing for us to improve and get right. Did you concur with that? That was almost the primary focus of the suggested solution.
Charlie, I actually found it really heartening because what they are recommending is exactly what we've done in our small world, and we've achieved some really great results. Actually, basically following the methodology they outline. Because their methodology is like, well, first of all, we've got to find out what is food waste. So they start by categorizing, saying, well, edible, non-edible, which is exactly what we did. That was our starting point. Edible, non-edible. We've got to categorize and work out, and then they split it into different categories. Well, where's it coming from? Is it meat? Is it vegetables? Is it dairy? Is it, so you kind of really understand the problem, and then you obsessively measure it. Because once you start obsessively, if it's just like a giant bucket that food waste goes into. You can't get hold of it. And also you can't attach a monetary value to it, to the person who's suffering the waste. And you also can't attach a sort of a societal good to it if you can catch that waste and redistribute it to people who need it. So I think it's absolutely the right way. I mean, it entirely ties in with how in our little world we've approached it, and as I say, achieved great results, because we set out on a journey 3 years ago to say we want to go to zero edible food waste. We don't want anything that is edible to go in a bin. The bin was actually, a big skip, which then went off to anaerobic digestion. So it was better than what people used to do, which was put food into surplus, waste food into landfill. We stopped doing that. I think we got an award for stopping doing that about 25 years ago. We were the adopters of zero food to landfill, but then zero edible food goes to waste. And 3-year journey it took us, but we achieved it about 6 months ago. As I'm guessing that most of your audience is UK based.
Majority, yes.
Majority. So let's just bring food waste down to the UK level, because sometimes when you talk just about global level, it's kind of people are, it's too big. Let's just bring it down, because I think there's some really interesting numbers in the UK. In this UN-led initiative, there are 3 countries. There are 3 countries that have sort of put themselves forward to be exemplar countries. Those 3 countries are Brazil, Japan, and the UK. So it's sort of, there is a link there to the UK. And in the UK, the people who've sort of taken the lead on this initiative is this outfit called WRAP, who you may have heard of. You see them reported quite a lot in the UK. And what WRAP tell us is that in the UK, we've got about 10 million tons of food waste, 10 million tons. Again, quite a nice round number. And then interestingly, from our point of view, 1.3 million tons of that is from people who make food, people like us, manufacturers, processors. So 1.3 million by people who make food. And that is enough. That, if you translate that into kind of meals, that's enough for 3.3 million people to have 3 meals a day. If you could capture that 1.3 million tons of waste and redistribute it to hungry people, that would be 3 meals a day, every day of the year, for 3.3 million people.
Wow. And
this is the killer. How many people in the UK are using food banks at the moment?
How many? I don't know.
3.1 million people.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So it's kind of, and this is the other aspect of food waste. I mean, food waste, I actually it hasn't been a driver for us, the sort of methane, CO2, although we're sort of doing lots of stuff on that front as well. It's been about saying there are people using food packs, there are hungry people, there are people who are having tough times, and this food should not go into anaerobic digestion, let alone landfill. It needs to go to those people. And so that's what we've been trying to do, is to reduce food waste, which we've done. We've probably halved our food waste in that time, because we've just got, as we start to measure it, you halve it. What you measure, you can improve on. But then we've made sure that that food is getting to people who need it.
Just in terms of what makes up the rest of that 8.7 million tons of food waste in the UK, if it's not manufacturers producing that food waste, where does the rest of that come from?
Most of it in people's homes.
Yes. Okay.
As I mentioned earlier on, that's our issue. In the West, let's call it the West. That's our issue, is we throw away a lot of food at home. And the retailers have historically thrown away quite a lot of food. And you'll notice what's happened. Retail have been really moving, working under this initiative with WRAP, which ties back to the UN initiative, because WRAP are there as the sort of the executor of the exemplar country, the UK, and this big global initiative. So these all links up. But over the last few years, best before dates have been slowly being removed from lots of products in supermarkets. There were a few people who went early, but basically now all of the supermarkets are moving to this thing. We're not going to put best before dates on. Use by date, this is some kind of consumer education here. A use by date means you must use it by this day, or it might have a negative impact on your health. I mean, so meat needs a use by date. Generally, vegetables do not use by date. How we determine as consumers whether those vegetables are okay to eat. We look at them and we smell them, and if they look off and they smell off, don't eat them. But you don't need a use by date. Actually, if you eat a leek which has started to go a bit off, it's not going to do you any harm. So you don't need a use by date on it. And this best before date was a kind of nonsense. And so there was masses of waste being generated by best before dates.
Well, that is encouraging to hear that we're making progress. And I guess what I would love to know, what are the things that you do to reduce the amount of waste in your production process?
It's a lot of hard work from a lot of people. And it's a lot of measuring and recording and trend analysis. And I'll take an example of why do we need to drain any food waste at all? Are we just being hopeless? I mean, fair question. So I'll take a dish that we make that some of your listeners may have eaten, chicken tikka masala. So when we make a chicken tikka masala, it's made up of 3 elements. We sell it. There's basically some cooked chicken, a delicious, marinated and cooked chicken, a delicious tikka sauce, and then we sell it with some rice, some delicious basmati rice together. So when we're making that today, we will cook the chicken, cook the sauce, cook the rice. They're all separately. They need to, and then they come together to be joined into the product that then goes out to supermarkets. Now we might make let's say we're making 1,000 chicken tikkas today. When we're doing that, those ingredients, they won't be in perfect ratios. We're trying to get them into a perfect ratio. But when we actually come to put the 3 together, we suddenly find out, we've got to the end, we've run out of chicken. So that means now but we haven't quite run out of sauce and we haven't quite run out of rice. So those then become surplus and they're going to go off. So by the time we can cook some more chicken to use them, we can't use them because then they've kind of gone beyond that. And so those become waste. Now, if you measure obsessively exactly how much every day and trend it, you can get the alignment of those 3 better.
I'm with you.
You're never going to get it perfect. So we can't eliminate waste altogether. What we can do, though, is if there's a little bit of sauce left at the end and a little bit of rice, rather than do the easy thing, chuck it in the skip, we can say, okay, now we're going to get a separate team to come in to take that off to one side, to somewhere else, to put it carefully into trays or bags or whatever, in the right proportion that it's going to be used, put a label on it, call one of our charity partners and say, we've got 3 5-kilo bags of delicious chicken tikka sauce. Can you get those to a charity?
And that was you brought me on perfectly to my next question, which was, what do you do with the waste that you do create? And the point is that you go out of your ways in order to ultimately redistribute the waste so that it can essentially be used by another.
Yeah. And obviously that's quite complicated. We've built relationships with some fantastic charities, City Harvest in London, Fair Share in the Southwest, and we're involved in the King's Initiative, which is the Coronation Food Project, and all of that comes together to really help all of that food that is waste, surplus to what we need to get out. And of course, our food is fresh, so we haven't got long to get it out. We can't sort of think, let's deal with this at the end of the week. We have to deal with it every day, and so that gets quite complicated.
And the point is that you've now, having embarked on this initiative 3 years ago, you've now got to a net zero waste business. Is that right, in terms of the food production side?
We have, and what we're but we haven't reached the end, and I think that's the other thing is you always have to keep challenging yourself. Whatever it is you're doing, you say, okay, well done, everybody. We've done a great job. We've gone from, 1.5% waste to zero, and all of that is going to charities, and that's fantastic. But if you remember, I talked as the UN report did about the first thing you do is you categorize edible and non-edible. So now we're going to say, okay, let's now go back and take a look at that non-edible, and let's see how we can make some of that edible.
Explain. You're going to have to walk me through a dish and explain to me, Charlie. How?
I'll give you a very simple example. So again, we've got a little bit of spare rice. Okay, if it's spare rice, that's edible. If somebody drops that rice on the floor, it becomes inedible. And you say, okay, well, that's you run a tight organization. There won't be very much, And I had a chat with our person who's sort of in charge of all our operations. I said, Mark, I think we should measure how much we're dropping on the floor. And he said, yeah, that's a good idea. I don't think there'll be much. There's never much, but there's a bit. Anyway, we went and measured it a couple of months ago, and we drop 800 kilos of food on the floor every week.
Every week? Wow.
That sounds like, it's a lot, but it's not. It's not. Okay. You're making food every week, which is feeding 1 million people. So it's a very tiny percentage, but 800 kilos, that's enough to feed, to create 2,500 meals. So we're going to recategorize that as actually, okay, it's kind of inedible, but we're going to say, no, we've got to find a way of it not being inedible. We're going to catch it before it hits the floor, and then we're going to be able to bag it up and get it out to our charity partners.
That does explain, Charlie. I'm fascinated. I think we'll possibly, if you've enjoyed the experience, have to get you back on for when we've discovered exactly how that initiative is going to work and we can turn inedible into edible food. I have to admit, I think my partner's ears would have pricked up as soon as you started talking about this, thinking he might get some tips here on how to produce a decent.
So Charlie, I think the thing is about us doing this. We're not a tiny business, but we're a tiny part of the food industry. What we do is less than 1%. And so, are we going to change the world by doing our brilliant team doing brilliant things to get our waste down and down and down and down, and just never accept that we've reached the end? And we're not. We're actually not going to have any impact at all. Really. In the UK, let alone globally, eating into that mountain of 1 billion tons of global food waste. We're not going to make an impact on that. Where I think businesses, smaller businesses like ours, and perhaps I hope like some of the businesses being run by your listeners, I think the opportunity for us is to be. It sounds a little bit arrogant maybe, but we aim to be a beacon business. We aim to do things that people can say, oh, that's interesting. They're a small little business in the UK and they did that, but they've kind of documented it. They've proved a path. They've proved a way. We might do it too. And so that's what we're trying to do here. And by the way, the really interesting thing from a business point of view, and why I think this can take hold, is we have had to invest money to make this work. We tried and tried, and I think one of our learnings was the thing that really moved the dial, and we started to make progress. And we said, right, there's £100,000. We're going to invest £100,000 in making this work, because the cheapest thing is to just go and chuck it in the skip, your surplus. But so we invested £100,000, and that's in the labour to pack it and the packaging to and the distribution and all that. So it's cost us £100,000, more than that actually, £100,000 a year. But what we can demonstrate is not only have we done some great things and we've distributed over 500,000 meals as a result, and massive tick. But also we can demonstrate actually it's brought profit back into the business.
And therefore, coming back full circle to the beginning of this conversation, Charlie, providing a really kind of key commercial argument as to why doing good as a business is ultimately the most profitable and long-term thinking way of developing your business anyway.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating. Again, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, talking about leaders of businesses and how the fat cats, if you like, the Lamborghini drivers are the ones that get a lot of the airtime, if you like, in terms of the way that our media covers entrepreneurship and business in general. However, there are a lot more people that really just want to do good with the businesses that they set up out there that perhaps don't get as much of the limelight. What you're describing to me is you're describing the type of influence that you mentioned, Beacon, but it's the influence that you can have as, yes, in the global scheme of things, a relatively small player, but ultimately, if you can prove and share and be transparent about what you've done in order to achieve the goals and the outcomes that you have, you can inspire others to do the same. And that's ultimately an amazing sort of legacy to leave, I suppose. I'm now going to conclude by asking you the magic wand question. I'm fascinated to see what you're going to choose to do with this. Charlie, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
We've been a B Corp for the last 5 years or so. I think the B Corp, I'm sure you're very familiar with it. It's a wonderful organization. Quite a lot of UK businesses signed up to it. And if you become a B Corp, in simplistic terms, you sign up to this idea of a triple bottom line. You're not there just to make a profit. You are there, you're trying to balance your business between profit, people, and planet. So B Corp is great. One of the things that B Corp is championing at the moment, and I'm 100% behind, and if I had my magic wand, I would wave it and make this happen tomorrow, is for the Better Business Act to be passed. So the Better Business Act, there are lots of us, B Corp and others, lobbying the government to say, pass the Better Business Act, actually put it into law that businesses have a responsibility beyond the bottom line. They have to be, embedded in their communities, and they have to sign up to looking after the world we're in. Business cannot exist purely for profit. It has to do more than that.
Well, I think that is what it really comes down to. It's a slightly broken or slightly misaligned system that we're all trying to operate in, and we need these tweaks, if you like, to enable the players of the game to operate accordingly. Charlie, it's been brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time this morning and joining me. It's been great fun.
Very nice to talk to you, Charlie.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A massive thank you to Charlie Bigham for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.